Billionaire CEO saw the black maid feed his blind son, and she changed his life forever. He had everything: wealth, power, and influence. Yet for all his success, this billionaire CEO never noticed the people who quietly held his world together. Until one morning in a crowded restaurant, his blind son struggled to eat. No one moved, except for a humble black maid working nearby. What she did next seemed so small, yet it stopped the entire room. In that single moment, something inside the billionaire shifted forever. But what did she do, and why did it leave him speechless? For years, Richard Holden lived in a world where success was measured in numbers, profits, awards, and the silent envy of his competitors. As the head of one of the city's largest corporations, his life was orchestrated by schedules, luxury, and people who existed to serve. The world admired him, yet few knew the weight he carried, raising his only son Ethan, who had been blind since birth. To Richard, love was shown through provision, not presence. His life had no room for emotion, only control. Miles away, in a small apartment at the edge of the city, lived Grace, an aging black maid who worked endless hours cleaning the homes of people who barely remembered her name. Her hands were rough, her back weary, but her spirit gentle. Each morning, she whispered a prayer for strength before facing another day in a world that often looked past her. Their worlds were never meant to meet. One belonged to marble floors and tinted glass, the other to cracked linoleum and fading hope. Yet fate had a quiet way of crossing paths that were never supposed to align. It was a sunny afternoon when Richard decided to take his son out for lunch, a rare gesture that carried more guilt than joy. The restaurant buzzed with chatter, waiters gliding past tables filled with laughter, and in that room of comfort and privilege, a small act of kindness was about to unfold, one that neither power nor money could ever buy. The restaurant gleamed with polished silver and quiet luxury. Waiters moved like shadows, their smiles carefully measured. Richard Holden sat at the corner table, his suit immaculate, his phone never far from his hand. Across from him sat Ethan, his blind son gently feeling for his utensils. Each motion was tentative, every reach uncertain. Richard barely looked up. Ethan's fork slipped, clattering softly against the plate. The sound drew quick, uncomfortable glances from nearby tables. A mother hushed her child who had turned to stare. Richard sighed, more out of habit than concern, before waving a waiter over. But none of them stepped forward. They hesitated, exchanging quiet looks as if unsure how to help, without breaking the unspoken boundaries of their world. From across the room, Grace noticed. She'd been wiping down a counter, invisible to everyone as always. She saw the boy's trembling hands, the way he fumbled with his napkin, the helplessness that no one dared to meet with compassion. Her instinct told her to move, but her mind screamed caution. In this place, people like her were not meant to be seen, much less intervene. Still, something deeper stirred inside her. She had once cared for a blind niece before losing her to illness years ago. The memory ached in her chest, whispering, "Don't turn away." Grace hesitated only a moment longer before walking toward the table. Her steps felt heavier with every eye that followed. Conversations paused. Thoughts stopped mid-air. Even the pianist missed a note as silence spread like a ripple. She reached the boy's side quietly, speaking softly so only he could hear. Her hands guided his gently toward the plate, steadying him. She cut a piece of food, lifted the fork, and helped him eat with tender patience, every movement careful, human, and filled with dignity. Around them, whispers began. Some faces twisted in discomfort, others in quiet disapproval. "She shouldn't be touching him," someone muttered under their breath. A waiter froze near the doorway, unsure whether to intervene. Richard finally looked up. At first, confusion crossed his face, then surprise, then something colder. His jaw tightened as he took in the sight. His blind son being fed by a maid in a faded uniform, a woman the world had taught him to look past. But as seconds passed, something unexpected flickered in his eyes. The boy's expression softened, calm and grateful. For once, Ethan wasn't struggling. He smiled, a small, genuine smile that Richard hadn't seen in years. Grace continued helping him, her touch gentle, her eyes lowered out of respect. She didn't see the room's judgment. She only saw the child. Then, as quickly as she had appeared, she stepped back, murmured an apology, and turned to leave. The air felt heavy with everything unspoken, class, color, and quiet courage. Richard watched her walk away, his chest tight with emotions he didn't yet understand. He glanced at his son again, at the peaceful look on the boy's face. For the first time, Richard realized how far money and power had carried him from something as simple and as profound as human kindness. And though the moment had passed, the image of that black maid helping his blind son burned in his mind like a truth he could no longer ignore. The room stayed frozen long after Grace stepped away. Conversations resumed in uneasy whispers, but the air felt charged with something unspoken. Richard sat there motionless, his hand resting near his son's. He could still see her hands guiding Ethan's, steady, kind, unafraid. For years Richard had paid people to care, to manage to fix what he could not face. Yet no one, not a therapist, not a private tutor, had ever reached his son the way that woman did in a single act. It was a kindness unbought, unmeasured, and undeserved. The restaurant manager rushed over, his voice tight with apology. "Sir, we'll handle this." She had no right to touch, but Richard's glare stopped him cold. The anger that had once fueled his boardroom victories now burned with shame. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the marble floor. Eyes turned toward him, expecting outrage, perhaps a demand to have the maid dismissed. Instead, he looked toward the kitchen where Grace had disappeared, his voice low but firm. "Where is she?" No one answered. The manager fumbled for words, muttering about staff boundaries, policies, reputation. Each excuse made the silence heavier. Ethan reached out then, his small hand brushing his father's arm. "Dad." "She helped me." His voice trembled, but there was peace in it, pure, simple gratitude. Richard's breath caught. For the first time, he truly saw his son. Not the disability, not the struggle, but the quiet courage that had gone unnoticed. He looked around the room filled with polished faces, realizing how blind he had been all along. He walked toward the back hallway, ignoring the whispers that followed. Each step echoed louder than the next, echoes of guilt, awakening, and humility colliding inside him. When he finally found her near the service door, she was folding her apron, ready to leave quietly as if nothing had happened. She didn't look up. Richard paused, words caught in his throat. For a man who had commanded thousands, silence was unfamiliar. But this time silence spoke louder than power ever could. In that moment, something inside him broke, and something else began to heal. Richard stood there for a long time, watching Grace fold her apron, as if the moment in the restaurant had meant nothing. But to him it meant everything. For the first time in his life, the man who owned half the city's skyline felt small, humbled by a woman whose power came not from wealth, but from compassion. He approached her quietly, unsure how to begin. The same man who had built empires now struggled to find words simple enough to carry gratitude and guilt in the same breath. Grace didn't need his apology. She only offered a small nod, eyes steady as if to say, "You don't need to thank me, just see me." Days passed, but Richard couldn't shake the image of her helping his son. It replayed in his mind each night. The steadiness of her hands, the grace in her silence. Something inside him had shifted. The world hadn't changed, but he had. In the weeks that followed, he reached out to the restaurant, not to complain, but to ensure Grace was recognized, supported, and safe from the quiet consequences that people like her often faced for simply being human. He didn't make a speech or call a press conference. Instead, he started something smaller, a scholarship fund for workers' children in Grace's name. But perhaps the greatest change wasn't public at all. It was in how he began to see his own son. Richard learned to slow down, to listen, to touch his hand when words failed. Through that moment of humility, he realized that blindness wasn't just his son's burden, it had been his own. The city moved on, as cities always do, but somewhere within it, two lives had changed forever, one because of kindness, the other because of awakening. Sometimes it takes the simplest act from the humblest heart to open the eyes of those who never knew they were blind.